to proceed first.
Yeah, thanks, Ken Corley. Yeah, just maybe a couple of brief points, and just maybe in response to Deputy Fian. I mean, every citizen and every person has to be accountable for their actions and for their behaviour. But I think politicians have to realise that the decisions that are made and the consequences that are then meted out to people in terms of their livelihood often causes people to get upset, and justifiably so. And the thanks that we get, that he says he isn't looking for, is if people have and decide at the end of your term of office, should you stand again, to re-elect you. That should be thanks enough, and I think we should have confidence in the public's ability to make rational judgments and to hold us to account for our actions, whatever they may be. Just in terms of the bill itself and the whole backdrop of the public service, I mean, the reality is that Croke Park and Haddington Road have facilitated a situation whereby working in the public service has been stood on its head really over the past number of years. And when we look at a technical bill that seeks to facilitate redeployment within the public sector, I do think that it's important we put it in the context of what's been done to date and the direction in which it's going in the future. Because public sector workers have made phenomenal sacrifices over the past number of years. Cuts in pay, cuts in employment conditions and so on have probably been unrivalled with other sectors of the economy. And up against that, they've had to deal with a billionaire-owned press who engage in public sector bashing on a routine basis, and that ideology is pumped out there. The idea that public sector workers are underworked and overpaid is constantly put out by the media, and of course it's not true and doesn't stand up to any statistical analysis whatsoever. In fact, the discrepancies in pay between low and middle income public servants and those at the very top are absolutely vast, and the majority of public sector workers are poorly paid in many instances, a whole number of them, thousands of them, depending on family income supplement and so on, to make a decent living and so on. So I think it's important to say that. I think it's important to say that the cuts in jobs, over 30,000, have made savings on paper, but they've come at an enormous cost, because on paper it can say, oh, people are working more efficiently now, things are being done better. But the reality on the ground is that lots of things aren't being done that could be done, and the public are losing out, and those workers at the coalface in many instances are losing out as well. Because if you took the situation abstractly and you said, right, if you have a surplus of workers, it makes great sense to look at an idea of redeployment, matching need to where the gaps arise and so on, people being flexible. On paper, that looks fine. But it's not as simple as that, because clearly a guard can't do the job of a vacant guidance counsellor. A clerical officer in the Department of Social Protection can't take up a nurse's job. Skill sets have to be matched and so on, which makes it more complicated. And it is the case that we don't have a surplus of staff. In actual fact, there are not enough public service workers in whole sectors of the economy. Now, other deputies have dealt with the areas of health, education, the Gardaí, and these areas which are debated in this chamber many, many times. They need extra resources. But when you look, I want to spend a little bit of time just looking at the whole area of the county councils and what's gone on in that regard, because it can look like a sensible idea to redeploy people, but what are we really doing? And we have to see it in the context of the recruitment embargo as well. If you look at the scenario where a lot of services are in effect being outsourced, that's the reality of it. It's not that jobs don't need to be done, but there are less public services because the service that they provided has been outsourced to a private company. We see that in areas of the local authorities, for example, in the area of refuse collection. There was a surplus then of bin workers. Those bin workers, in one hand, were able to be utilised by the local authorities to be transferred or redeployed into other areas, but that came with a lot of difficulties as well, because those workers, many of them had worked for decades in a particular environment, and transfer into a new environment where you're bottom of the pile doesn't always work out for anybody, the worker or management in that regard. And of course, the reality is that while the council may have been able to utilise those bin workers elsewhere, The public had to pay for the service through a private operator, and the people doing that job, who previously had been in a public sector job, unionised, with a pension and secure employment, have been replaced by yellow pack work. And that's going to cost the economy in the long run, people in insecure, tentative employment. And I do think we need to factor that in. When we look at redeployment, we have to look at the backdrop of the public sector recruitment embargo and what the direction and the damage that this is doing to our public services. And we are storing up huge problems in that regard. There's been an absolute bottoming out of services. If you take Fingal County Council, the area I'd be more familiar with myself, 1,300 people work in Fingal County Council. There are not 20 below the age of 30. And that's a situation that is replicated in local authorities and the public sector. Young people are not being employed, which leads to a gap in knowledge. You have workers at the top who've left, you have a group in the middle, and nobody under 30 in practically many areas of our public services. That means we're losing out on an expertise that young people have in terms of social media, in terms of IT, and all the new sort of training and input that those people could have. That's a serious problem in the future. If you look at areas where clearly other deputies have made points about nobody would be in favour of forced redeployment, it's a huge issue and a huge concern for public sector workers. The idea of people being forced to uproot and move even within an area of 45 kilometres or so can be very dislocating for families, so people should never really be forced to be redeployed. But what about where people want to redeploy? And I've had many instances of this even already, that somebody wants to, say, move from one local authority to another local authority. They have a service and a skill which the new local authority could benefit for, but if they take on that worker, they're increasing their pay bill. And unless they can get somebody to swap in their local authority and send them back to the original one, the swap isn't going to happen. The redeployment isn't going to take place, because each organisation sees itself as an individual organisation. They don't see it as the entirety of the public service, with the result that I know of people who are out of work sick, who can't work in the organisation which they were originally employed to, who could transfer for various reasons of difficulty in the working environment, bullying or whatever, could transfer to another, but the other local authority won't take them because their budgets will then be increased. And I think that's something that we need to look at. I think we need to look at the overall skill set as well, because, you know, redeployment is all well and good on paper, but when there aren't the skills there and there aren't the people there to fill it, well, you can't move people in. And I just want to use briefly the issue of libraries, again, in Fingal County Council, because, you know, you can't redeploy people into vacancies of librarians. It's a particular skill set. There was no point. They couldn't transfer the bin men into running the libraries in Fingal. Clearly, that couldn't happen. Now, we raised it with the Minister before. The Minister says, well, in areas where skill sets are weak, we can look for a derogation. People can be employed. The recruitment embargo can be breached if there's a need for it there. But here you come into the problem that if the local authority does that within the constraints of the budget that it has, what other services are going to be forfeited instead of that? So it doesn't really make sense in that regard, and it is an anomaly. We don't have decent public services. Fingal County Council is the most utilised public library service in the country. 59% of the population are members of the library. The state has expended good programmes in developing library services and new libraries in a number of areas. And now we have a problem. They cannot be staffed. Because of the age profile of the staff, there are now only 100 librarians for the whole of the county. 50% of those people are over the age of 50. 5 of them want to retire this year, and another 2 want to go early this year, which will bring the numbers dramatically down. And what the council have been forced to do in that regard is shut the library at lunchtime, shut the mobile service and the housebound service in the summertime, get a few temporary workers in, but it doesn't really plug the gap in that regard. And to me, this is lunacy. Against the backdrop of recession, where library membership has sharply increased since 2011, with people sitting at home needing to access IT services, needing to access books, to do CVs or whatever, these are potential areas that could be developed. The real issue here that we should be discussing, there is no difficulty with public sector workers adapting. I think they've demonstrated that time and time again, their willingness to do that. The problem simply is there isn't enough of them. And this really shouldn't be a bill about redeployment. It should be a bill about recruitment, because not only does that make sense in the sense of delivering the type of services that citizens need, and people actually need public services even more in a recession, it also makes sound economic sense, because the cutback in public sector numbers has been, in my opinion, seriously bad for the economy. It's resulted in job losses in the private sector. The money being taken out of public sector workers' pay packets has deflated the domestic economy and contributed to many of the problems that we have. So I think really those are the issues that we should be discussing rather than the issue of redeployment itself.